format. As many of you know, UVA is offering 6 courses in partnership with Coursera this spring. Dr. Koller took a bachelor's and master's degree from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, her PhD from Stanford, and she completed postdoc work at UC Berkeley. She's the author of more than 200 articles and peer-reviewed publications in a variety of disciplines. She works in machine learning and probabilistic modeling with applications to computer vision, systems biology, and personalized medicine. She embodies interdisciplinarity as far as I can go. Coursera was founded only 2 years ago. But in 1 year, okay, even more rapid growth. 1 year ago, and in that relatively short period, the company has captured the attention and imagination of educators, policymakers, and the general public. The technology and business models employed by Dr. Koller and her colleagues are extending campus resources from universities in the US and in the UK to hundreds of thousands of learners worldwide. In the last week alone, Coursera has captured headlines in the LA Times, Chronicle of Higher Education, Forbes India, Times Higher Education, San Francisco Times, Wall Street Journal, Business Insider, and many more. As an educator, academic, and dean of a school that comprises creative and very innovative faculty, I'm thrilled to have Daphne here with us today. I'm struck by what our two seemingly different organizations have in common. Coursera's goal, stated on their website, is to empower people with education that improve their lives, the lives of their families, and the communities they live in. We here at UVA and at Curry share that aspiration and often employ similar methods in service to that goal, albeit on a dramatically different scale. We're only operating in the thousands, not the hundreds of thousands. The Curry School's offered courses to residential students and students off-grounds for many years, and increasingly are moving into the online world. And we learn from those movements more each day, both how to expand our reach and access to more and more people, but also to learn more about the teaching and learning that contributes in many ways to their lives and outcomes. So it's in this spirit of advancing the connection between education and innovation that it is my great pleasure to welcome Daphne Koller to the University of Virginia and the Curry School of Education.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the gracious invitation, the flattering introduction. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to tell you about what has really been, I think, and people often make the mistake that we've been here for 3-4 years, and it's really only been a year. And in fact, it's been 9 months since we launched in April of 2012. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this project and how it came to be. So the title of the talk is The Online Revolution, Education for Everyone. And we're going to start and end the talk with Education for Everyone, and in the middle is going to be the online revolution. So we started this in January 2012. And just as we were starting it, there was an important reminder to all of us of why we were doing this. In large parts of the world, parts that are not as fortunate as we have here in the United States, people just don't have access to the kind of high-quality education that they want and deserve. Africa specifically, as well as many other parts in the developing world, have serious capacity constraints where there just are not enough positions to accommodate the growing demand. One such country is South Africa, where the educational system was built in the days of apartheid for the white minority. Now there's a lot more people who want an education and they just can't get it. The fraction of qualified applicants who get into South Africa's top public institutions is 1%, leaving a lot of demand unfulfilled. So in January 2012, that came to a tragic event where the University of Johannesburg had closed its enrollment process. There were a handful of slots left open. And so they were going to reopen those slots for general admission. And when they did that, there was literally a line a mile long outside the gate of people wanting to be first to get one of those coveted positions. And when the gates opened in the morning, there was a stampede to be first in line. And 20 people were injured and 1 woman died. She was the mother of a son. And she literally died trying to give her son a chance at a better life. This is a particularly poignant event, and it doesn't happen, fortunately, all that often, but the demand that this represents is very much a fact of life in many parts of the world. Now, that's one aspect of this. Then, of course, there's the other aspect, the one that we're much more familiar with here at home, where people continually talk about access to higher, about the cost of different things. And you can see here medical care at the top. This is starting from 1985 on the left, going to 2011 on the right. You can see medical care at the top, except it's not. At the very top of the chart are college tuition and fees, which have increased almost twice the rate of medical care. Now, to be fair, a large part of this is due to decrease in state subsidies for public education. But for whatever the reason, the fact is that education is becoming increasingly unaffordable, even here in the United States, for a large number of people who are now debating between paying tuition and buying food. So these are some of the reasons why we want to solve this problem, why we want to do something. And then in 2012, right after we launched, Tom Friedman wrote up about this effort, and he put it better than anyone else did. And this is one of my favorite quotes, where he said, "The big breakthroughs are what happen, and what is suddenly possible means what is desperately necessary." So desperately necessary were the first two slides. What's suddenly possible was exemplified in the big Stanford classes that came to being in the fall of 2011. So this is an experiment that Stanford did back in August, September, where they decided to take 3 computer science classes, pretty advanced, and make them open to everyone around the world to register in. And within weeks, each of those classes had an enrollment of 100,000 students or more. Now, to understand the magnitude of that number, we could look at one of those classes, the largest of the 3 when taught at Stanford. It's my colleague Andrew's machine learning class. It has an enrollment of 400 when it's taught as a Stanford class, which is pretty big by Stanford standards. When Andrew opened that class up to the world, it had an enrollment of 104,000 students. So if you think about the math of this, in order for Andrew to reach that same size audience, he would have to teach a Stanford class for 250 years. So given that that's not what Andrew wants to do for the next 250 years, the impact and the opportunity here is to really offer a high-quality education, something that comes close, maybe not quite the same, but pretty darn close to a Stanford education, to everyone around the world at a marginal cost that is closer to $0 than to $1 per student. And that, I think, is the opportunity that these courses offer, these massive open online courses. So since those Stanford courses back in the fall, we've come a long way. There's now 33 universities that are working with us. UVA, we're very proud to have as one of them, offering courses to people around the world. Currently, this is a slide that's very hard to keep up to date, but people keep adding courses. I think we're up to 225 courses across the range of disciplines. We have, again, hard to keep updated, close to 2.7 million students from 196 countries. This is unique students. If you count course enrollments, this is a statistic that I got from one of our team members today. The number of course enrollments per month is 1.45 million course enrollments per month. And those numbers are a little bit staggering when you think about them. So here is the universities that we have been very fortunate to have partnered with us. You see a lot of names that you recognize. Private institutions like Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, Duke, Caltech, Penn, public institutions like UVA, University of Washington, University of Toronto, domestic international institutions. We have 8 non-US institutions represented here, including some courses that are taught in languages other than English. EPFL is teaching courses in French, and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology is about to start offering courses in Chinese. The courses span a remarkable range. People tend to think that online courses are primarily in computer science or maybe in STEM, but that's about it. And that turns out to be not the case. We have had about as much adoption from other disciplines that are not even close to STEM. You can see here introduction to philosophy, mental health and illness, global challenges, and Tessa's course from here at UVA, Road to Greatness, photography, the modern, the postmodern. We have a course in astrobiology, women in the civil rights movement. It's really quite a remarkable spectrum of courses that one can now offer through an online format at this effectively zero marginal cost per student. So let's talk a little bit about the students. I'm going to give you a few anecdotes of the kinds of students that we have, and at the end I'll give you some statistics that are more broad than that. So here are some examples. It's very dim. Can you actually see the picture on the left?
No.
Sorry, I don't know what's, the projector doesn't seem to be very bright. Okay, so this, you can't see him, but his name is Raul. Raul wanted to study computer science, but there's no computer science programs at institutions in this country. And so he took a bunch of computer science courses on Coursera and used that as the basis for submitting his Fulbright application. Was awarded a Fulbright application, is now coming to study in the United States. Jolene lives in Pakistan. She took Princeton's Intro to Sociology class and was inspired by what she heard there and decided that she was going to change careers and found an NGO together with a fellow classmate on the Coursera class that she took. And Achint is a kid from an Indian village who wanted to be an entrepreneur. He took the gamification class from Wharton and got an internship as a result of that and is now competing in an all-India entrepreneurship competition. These are the kinds of stories that I think you might expect to find in this kind of endeavor. But I'm going to give you one that you maybe didn't expect. This is Daniel, sitting on the right. Daniel is 17 years old and is severely autistic. He has a speaking vocabulary of about 150 words. He communicates by typing on an iPad. And he was the star student in the University of Pennsylvania's Modern and Contemporary American Poetry class. You can see the professor, Al Fillery, sitting on the left. Daniel and his parents tell us that not only is this the first meaningful education experience that he has ever had after a life of special ed, but furthermore that the rigor of the content combined with the reduced need for social interaction and the shorter attention span of the videos are actually helping alleviate his disease. Now we actually hear stories like that from a lot of autistic students. We also hear stories that are similar in spirit from people who have other types of diseases. Just about 3 weeks ago, we got an email from somebody who has stage 4 breast cancer, and because she has chemotherapy, she can't really do much outside the house, but this gives her the ability to actually sort of think beyond what she's experiencing right now to something that's more stimulating and exciting for her. And so this is a different kind of access that this opens up to people. Actually, I got an email from Daniel today, this morning. He heard about the keystroke verification system that we put in place that I'll tell you about in a little bit, what we call the signature trap. And he said that he's volunteering to participate in that because his typing is so different from others that he wants to see whether it's still, the system's still broad enough to encompass his typing pattern. So it's just really nice to get that kind of email unsolicited. Anyway, I'll come back to this keystroke in a bit. Okay, so what makes these courses different from other online courses that have been presented previously? So most online courses, MIT's OpenCourseWare, the leader in this from back in 2001, iTunes U, YouTube EDU, these are all static content. People come in, they sit there passively, they watch videos, they either get it or don't, and that's the end of the experience. This is our attempt to provide at scale a similar experience for a student who is on campus taking a college class. And so every week there's content that the student is responsible for learning, and every week the student is responsible for doing homework. And the homework is graded, and the student gets feedback on the homework as to whether they're getting it and they aren't getting it. And so, and if the student doesn't do the work, they don't get a grade, and if they don't get a grade, they don't pass the course. So very similar in some sense to taking a college class. And you can see the effect of deadlines in the usage graph on our website. So the x-axis is time, the y-axis is number of users on the site. And you see those bumps? Those bumps are the day before the deadline. Everybody logs in the night of the deadline to do their homework. Actually, if you see this bump was the day of the deadline, and they realized that they needed to move it up, so those are all the day before the deadline. So it turns out that procrastination is a pretty universal phenomenon. And then at the very end, there is a reward. The students get a certificate. It's not a credit-bearing certificate, although I'll come back to that at the end about some stuff that we've done recently with that. But it's enough that we know that students have been using these to give them access to a better job. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the student experience that actually has 3 pillars associated with it. The first is the video content. where the lectures are actually, where the content is actually presented. Now, one of the nice things when you move to a video-based format, if you realize that you shouldn't and needn't be doing lecture capture, is that you can break away from the constraints of in-classroom instruction and do something that is a lot more creative. And so that comes up in a variety of different ways. First of all, it comes up in the kinds of experiences that instructors put together. So here on the top left, for example, is the Illinois Sustainability class that shot a lot of the videos on site at different places where sustainability issues are much more apparent, and the students really got a lot from that. Bottom left is the Introduction to Sociology class from Princeton, where the instructor, in addition to having the standard lecture modules that he had every week, he also had a weekly discussion group with a group of students, 2 of whom were from Princeton, and the remaining 6 or 7 were from other countries around the world. And they were discussing the sociological question of the day. And the professor there, Mitch Denier, tells us that the global perspective that he got on sociology, which after all is very much a cultural phenomenon, was totally unique in that he learned more from teaching this one class in this global format than he learned from teaching this class for 12 years at Princeton, where basically year after year he gets pretty much the same questions. And here he got a completely different range of questions and opinions. Top right, Zeke Emanuel, formerly a senior advisor to President Obama for the Obamacare Act, actually doing an interview as part of his class at the same time that the Supreme Court decision on the Obamacare Act came up in June. And bottom right, the gamification class from Wharton, the character that you can only faintly see because of the projector in the middle is actually the instructor as a computer game character. So you can do a lot of interesting and creative things. The other thing you can do is, why don't you teach students for 50 minutes or 75-minute chunks? Because of the constraints of classroom scheduling. Because you need to put people in the room, teach them for a certain amount of time, and then they need to clear the room for the next class, right? That's not the optimal time block for content, and it's certainly not the optimal time block for students' attention spans. And so one thing that you can do is break away from that and actually break up the content into much smaller modules that fit whatever piece of content you're trying to teach. We find that 8 to 12 minutes is about right. Shorter than that tends to fragment the experience. Too much longer than that, people start losing track. And now students can follow this in their own time, at their own pace. They can rewind where they want. They can fast forward where the instructor is being boring. And by the way, we track that so we can tell the instructor when they're being boring. And really gives students the flexibility to control their own learning in a way that is really not possible in a large lecture classroom where the instructor really has to teach the median of the population. Furthermore, you can personalize the experience even further. You can add, for example, content that is preparatory that some students might need, but perhaps not everyone, or optional content that might be of interest to some students but not others. And so really allows you to break away from the one-size-fits-all model of education that has been forced on us by the need to scale education to a large number of people by shoveling them into an auditorium for an hour and a half once a week. Now, that's the first part of the user experience. The second part, which I consider to be considerably more fundamental, is the interactivity with the material. This is one of the things that distinguishes this from previous open courseware efforts, is the fact that students constantly engage with the material. And this was based on studies that years of pedagogical studies, for example, this is one paper that came out in Science about a year and a half ago, that showed that even simple retrieval questions, do you remember what I just told you, help students in terms of long-term outcomes, much more so than just passively reviewing the material again, which is the middle bar over here. So how do we build interactivity into the platform? In a variety of ways. So here, for example, even those 8 to 12-minute chunks are not a single block. So here you see, and I have the sound shut off, and let's see if this works. Oh no, what happened? So this is Scott Page from University of Michigan. He's teaching a class on model thinking. When the video hits the yellow notch, there is sound usually when he speaks. When the video hits the yellow notch, the students get asked a question. They answer it. This time they got the wrong answer. They have an opportunity to maybe rewatch the video, try again. They resubmit. This time it's correct, and there's an optional explanation. Now, this is the kind of question that as an instructor I would normally ask in class. But what happens when I ask a question in class? 80% of the students are scribbling the last thing I said. The ones in the back are all on Facebook. And then there's a smarty pants in the front row who blurts out the answer before pretty much anyone else has even noticed that a question has been asked. At which point, I as an instructor am terribly gratified that somebody at least answered my question correctly, and the class moves on. Here, every single student has to engage with the question. Now, of course, that's not where the meaningful learning happens. These little baby questions are a good way of encouraging retention and engagement, but they're not really a place where deep learning occurs. So in order to do deep learning, you have to have students practice with the material and do deep work. And that, of course, sets up a really important question. If you have a class with 100,000 students, does your institution fund 5,000 teaching assistants to grade the work? So Stanford was not up for that, which left us needing other solutions. So we took a two-pronged approach, the first of which is get a computer to do the painful work of grading, which nobody enjoys anyway. And so it turns out that you could actually grade a fair variety of different kinds of work at scale using computer grading techniques. So in addition to your good old multiple choice, you could do short answer grading, fill in the blank style questions. You could also do math expressions in a fairly deep way that looks at the semantic content of the expression rather than the syntactic identities of the one answer that the instructor wanted to put in. You could also do more interesting questions such as modeling and programming questions. So you can check a computer model of an electrical circuit, or of a bridge, or of a market, or of a company, and check that against what the instructor said was the right answer. As long as the output is structured in a way that you know what to expect in different parts of the output, you can check that and give students immediate feedback about their work. Now, the immediacy of the feedback is actually a really important component here, because when we teach students in on-campus classes, what typically happens is between the time that a material is taught, the student submits the work, the time that it's graded and they get it back, something like 4 weeks have elapsed. So when a student gets the work back and they're told that they got 70 out of 100, they say, darn it, I wish I would have done better. And they stick it in their binder, and that's the end of the process, because by this point they're learning something else, and there's no point going back, at least in their minds, to the material and relearning it better. Here, auto grading gives you feedback immediately, and that just incentivizes students, even without being told, to try and gamify the systems. Like, I got 70 out of 100, I can do better than that. And so they submit and they resubmit. And you can actually see that in the results here. So here's one of the assignments in a programming class. The blue bars is the distribution of the initial assignment. This is on a scale of 0 to 70. So the blue bars are the distribution of scores for the initial submission for that assignment. And the green bars are the final scores for that same population of students when they finish submitting as many times as they wanted. And you can see that students naturally gravitated towards getting effectively a perfect score on the assignment. Now, of course, everybody is probably sitting here scratching their head and saying, okay, so they got a better score on this assignment. Does that mean they learned anything better? Or does it mean that they just tried it often enough until they hit on the right answer? So we actually tested that recently. And you could actually see that for students whose performance, initial performance, the blue bars, on say problem set 1 is the same, the ones who did the mastery learning do better on problem set 2 than the ones who didn't. So, and in fact, it turns out that for every 3 points of improvement in the mastery learning on problem set 1, you get a 1 point improvement in problem set 2. So, of course, this is for one class, and this needs to be replicated more broadly, but it does suggest that the mastery learning approach actually does give rise to better learning outcomes, and I'll come back to that at the end. So that's all very well for certain kinds of assignments, but it doesn't solve the range of the kinds of assignments that instructors would like to give to students, and specifically the kinds of open-ended, critical thinking style assignments that are absolutely essential in the humanities, because nothing of the previous stuff that I mentioned really applies there, except perhaps for multiple choice. But even in other disciplines, you really want students to come up with answers that don't necessarily have a right answer that a computer can grade. And so in order to make that possible, we put into place something called peer grading, which builds on work that was done in the education community. It was specifically at UCLA, something called calibrated peer review. Some of you here might be familiar with that. It's a way of having students grade the work of others using a very carefully crafted grading rubric that is defined by the instructor. And so the students grade the work of their peers, to provide meaningful feedback to their fellow students, but in order to make this kind of thing work at a scale of tens of thousands of students, we needed to put in some ideas also from crowdsourcing, which is this thing that makes Wikipedia work. So we combined calibrated peer review, some ideas from crowdsourcing, and we now have a peer grading pipeline that allows you to do some very interesting and meaningful kinds of work. So for example, here is a genomics class from Penn, where the student's assignment is to take a scientific paper and critique it. And other students are now looking at the critique relative to the grading rubric provided by the instructor and saying, is this a good critique? Did the student hit on the important points, for example? Is it well thought out? And so the student now gets 5 pieces of feedback from their peers about the quality of their critique. Now, an obvious question when you're having unqualified students grade the work of others is this meaningful feedback or not? And so the answer, truthfully, to that is sometimes. A badly designed grading rubric gives you terrible, terrible results. So if, for example, you tell students, here's the assignment, give scores for part A on a scale of 0 to 30, you get complete garbage as a result. You have to craft the grading rubric very, very carefully. And one of the things that we're learning as part of this experiment is what are effective grading rubrics and what aren't. Here's an example of an effective grading rubric. This was in Princeton's sociology class that I mentioned earlier. What you see here, the TAs in that class actually went and graded every single assignment. So they graded several thousand assignments, which is a heroic task. And I can tell you, I looked at this final exam and it was hard. So the x-axis is the teacher score, rather the TA score, and the y-axis is the peer score, that is the work that the scores that were given by the 5 students aggregated. And you can see a very strong correlation between those 2 scores, to the point that we feel comfortable that with a well-designed grading rubric, this is meaningful feedback to students. Now this really opens up opportunities in disciplines that you might not necessarily think are amenable to online education. So here is the Wharton design class, and the students there had a semester-long project where they started out with a concept, moved on to a prototype, and ultimately to an actual artifact. And each week was an elaboration of the previous week. So each week they got feedback from 5 other people about the quality of their design. So by the end of the course, they had gotten feedback from something like 40 people. And here are some of the artifacts that were the final projects that were submitted in the course. These were some of the ones that got perfect scores, and I selected them because I thought they were cool. And after I selected them, I noticed that they came from 3 different continents. You see India, Spain, and the Philippines, and which really I think shows you the global reach of this. Now, one interesting surprise that came to us, that we found as a result of peer grading, was when we first did this, our intent was simply scalability. How do you grade this kind of work at a scale of tens of thousands of students when obviously an instructor can't do this? One of the other things that we found that was a surprise is that as a learning experience for the students, this was incredibly valuable because the student has just done this assignment on their own. And so their mind is primed about what are the issues in tackling that particular question. And now all of a sudden they're seeing 5 other solutions to that same problem. And they're saying, this is a different way of doing this than what I did, which is not something that people normally think about as they're doing these assignments. And so we've been told by numerous students that they've learned as much from doing the peer grading as they did from doing the assignment themselves. To the point that many of the instructors who have employed peer grading in the MOOC have now come back and are starting to employ it in their on-campus class, even though it's not for saving TA costs, it's simply for improving the student's experience. Which brings me to the last piece of this, which has to do with another aspect of peer grading, which is the community. Because the class is cohortized, which means everybody goes through it week by week, a sense of community forms around the material. And here, for example, in the poetry class, because everyone was working on the same assignment, the instructor had the essays that the students wrote on poetry, together with the peer comments, posted onto the discussion forum, and other people could now view it and continue the conversation as part of the discussion forum. And here you see an essay on Ezra Pound that had 60 different people posting on it and 872 views. So a real community forms around the material. So community is the last pillar of the student experience in these MOOCs. And community comes up both in the virtual and in the physical world. So in the virtual world, we have the discussion forum. Students post questions to the forum and other students answer them. And this is absolutely essential because if you have a single instructor answering questions from 20,000 students, that's just not a tenable thing. I can tell you how hard it is to answer questions from 200 students when I teach at Stanford. So 20,000 would be completely unmanageable. But here you're basically exploiting peer-to-peer teaching. And students really provide very thoughtful and detailed answers to each other's questions, and in some ways they're more useful than the answers I might provide because they just struggled through this material. So they kind of know what are the issues that other students might be having. And we've been told by numerous students that these forums are actually more of a community than they've experienced in physical classes. Now, one of the interesting things about MOOCs is that this is a place where having larger classes, counterintuitively, is a better experience than having smaller classes. Everybody says, let's have smaller classes. And, you know, that's great up to a point. I mean, if you have an instructor with 15 students, then you're right, smaller classes are better. But is an instructor with 100 students really better than an instructor with 300 is not so clear. But on the other hand, when you have more students, and the students actually help each other, the response time and the quality of the responses that you get from your fellow students actually improves. So what you see here is the number of active users in courses, and the response time, you can see that the response time decreases the more students you have. Now, I said that some of the interaction happens virtually, other happens physically. Students just organically self-organized into a set of communities that meet in different cities around the world. There's in over close to 1,600 cities where students get together and just talk about the material for a class that they're taking. And they help each other along with some of the difficult bits. And it's an incredibly valuable experience for keeping students retained and engaged. Now, another interesting part of this is that we have physical study groups. We also have virtual study groups that, again, assembled organically. And some of those study groups cross not just cross national boundaries to the point where you have people from countries that generally don't talk to each other and sometimes even hate each other, communicating with each other around the material. And we've seen some anecdotal stories of people saying, you know, maybe this other country isn't so bad after all. So it's kind of an interesting social phenomenon that's happening. Okay, so that's the student experience. Now I'm going to move to that last little bit of the graph that I showed you, which is the credit and credentials. What do students get at the end? And this is a new piece of this. So this is version 0.1. This is what Stanford let us give in the fall of 2011. They call it a statement of accomplishment. And here's what it was. It was a letter from the instructor to the students. It was signed by the instructor. And there was a huge amount of legal boilerplate at the bottom. It says, this does not stand for credit. Student identity not verified. There was no academic integrity enforced, blah, blah, blah. There's this whole, this does not correspond in any way to a Stanford course, and you know. So that was version 0.1. Interestingly, even version 0.1 was actually useful to people. Some departments actually gave credits for people who presented a Coursera statement of accomplishment. And that was good for them. A lot of people got jobs on the strength of presenting this and demonstrating competence in the material. So that's version 0.1. Version 1.0 launched about 4 weeks ago. This is what we call the signature track, and it's an attempt to get rid of some of that legal boilerplate. So the signature track is a way for students to opt in to taking a class under an identity verified mode. So the students, about 2 to 3 weeks into the class, after they decided they want to take this, can opt in to having their identity verified using a government-issued picture ID and a webcam photo. And then we create a biometric profile, which represents both their photo as well as a keystroke pattern. Turns out that my keystroke pattern is very different from your keystroke pattern, and it's very difficult to forge. And so we create a biometric profile, and then every time the student submits work, their biometric profile gets verified, so you know that it's they at the keyboard submitting the work. And so it's not a full academic integrity check, because somebody, of course, could still be sitting next to them telling them the answers. But I hate to tell you this, that's also true when people do homework in our So it's, you know, it's not perfect, but it's definitely an improvement. And the student basically then gets a university-branded certificate that doesn't have all this boilerplate at the bottom and has permanent storage on our site so that they can give a verification code to an employer, and the employer can check that the student indeed completed the course and is unforgeable. Now, because this now does cost money, because there's actually real costs associated with it. You need to check the biometric profile, and that's a third-party provider. But because we believe in open access education, we actually put into place a financial aid application, so that if students really need a more rigorous form of credential and they can't afford to pay for it, they fill out a form and they basically get this for free. And about 20 to 25% of our current signature track students are financial aid, and we don't pay them. Okay, so the final piece of this, and this is sort of a little bit looking forward, and I should have taken out the review underway because the review concluded about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. So this is all great for students who don't really care about getting degrees, but what about the students who really need a degree? These unofficial credentials don't get them there. So in collaboration with the American Council for Education, we have undertaken a credit equivalency review for a subset of our courses. This was initially a pilot, it's now going to be the standard. So the American Council of Education, for those of you who don't know it, is an umbrella organization that spans all U.S. academic institutions. It has been around for about 100 years, highly respected. One of the things that they do that's less familiar is something called the ACE Credit Review. And that started out, I think, in the military, where people basically came out of the military having gotten a lot of on-the-job training in whatever, electronics or garage mechanic or accounting or whatever, and they wanted to be able to apply that towards a degree. And it wasn't recognized because it wasn't in an academic institution. So the ACE credit recommendation process would go and evaluate these courses that were taught in non-traditional settings, this review was done by a faculty panel of experts in the area, and they would assess whether these courses were of the level and rigor that you would expect of an academic course on the same topic. And when they were, then the ACE would issue a credit recommendation, which then was, could be disseminated to 2,000 universities that are part of the ACE network. And these universities would then have the option of transcripting those credits when a student became a matriculated student at that institution. So this is a really elegant process because it's not the military that's giving credit, they can't, and it's not the ACE that's giving credit, they can't either. It's the institution where the student subsequently enrolls that's giving them the credit. So it effectively provides us with a solution to the same thing. A student can take the MOOC. It's not the university that provided the MOOC that's giving the credit. It's not ACE or Coursera that's providing the credit. Ultimately, if the student enrolls for a degree, they get credit for prior learning. And 5 of our courses were assessed by the ACE. All 5 passed the assessment. And so now students have the option for these 5 classes of actually using this to make progress towards a degree, which we think is a tremendous boon to these students. Okay, now I'm going to take a step back and talk about 2 other topics at a slightly higher level, and then we're going to conclude. So the one important benefit that ensues from this project is the amazing amount of data that's collected about students as they work their way through the system. Because we collect every single event that happens, where a student pauses the video, rewinds, fast forwards. Remember I told you about, if you fast forward, I'm a professor. Every quiz submission, every forum post, every time they looked at a forum post. And we collected at a scale of 20, 50,000 students. And so you can now learn things that you could never learn before, both at the level of individual courses and at the level of higher level pedagogy. So here, for example, something you can learn about an individual course. This is a distribution of wrong student answers from one of Andrew's machine learning exercises. And the answers happen to be pairs of numbers, and so you could graph them on this grid. And you can see that every little cross is a one-off wrong answer where the student found a particularly creative way of being wrong. The big crosses are the boring students that found the not creative way of being wrong. And the top left, for example, that big cross is where 2,000 students came up with exactly the same wrong answer. And if 2 students in a class of 100 have the same wrong answer, you'd never notice, but when 2,000 students converts the same thing, it jumps out at you. And so Andrew and his TAs went and looked at those answers, figured out the misconception that underlies them. And now every student whose answer falls into that bucket doesn't just get a sorry you're wrong message, they get a sorry you're wrong and you might want to think about this as a way of fixing the mistake that you made. And so they're starting to get personalized feedback that's targeted at the misunderstanding that they have. So that's one example. Here's the kind of example that transcends individual courses. You might wonder, does seeing an instructor's face in the video help or hurt students' learning. I've seen papers that make both cases. So I've seen papers that make one case and papers that make the other case. Well, because you could argue that it distracts the student's attention from what's happening on the slide. I mean, you could basically see it both ways. So now you can answer that question, because you could have what's called in Silicon Valley A/B testing. A/B testing is something that I'm sure you've all been subjected to without even knowing it. Because when you go on Google or Facebook or any one of those sites, on any given time, there's usually about 10% of the people who get a different experience than the remaining 90%. And whatever metrics the company cares about are tracked. And if the B group does better than the A group, then the entire platform shifts over to the B group in a matter of days. And so that's how they improve the platform continuously and iteratively. But we've never been able to do that in education, because it takes years to perform a study, and then another few years for that to be implemented in most cases. But now you can do this. So Professor Dan McFarland from Stanford did an A/B test on the professor's face. You can see Dan McFarland on the left group and not on the right group. Unfortunately, I can't give you the answers to this experiment because, wait. We had to stop the experiment in the middle because the students who weren't seeing the instructor's face complained bitterly that they were unable to focus. So, is that an indication of better learning outcomes? I don't know, but it's certainly an indication of student satisfaction. Here's another one. Does sending students an email a couple days before homework is due, does that increase with student retention? You would think the answer is yes. I mean, they're reminded that there's a deadline. Well, it turns out that you can now try it. So here we actually stratify the student population into 8 groups based on two values for 3 different things. You could tell the people what you did this week. That's the top thing. You could tell them about the upcoming deadlines. This is the reminder of what they still have to do. And you can have this infographic at the bottom that tells them how far along the course they are. So these are 3 different things that might appear in the email. We tried all 8 combinations of having subsets of those appear. And here's the interesting part. Only one of those actually improves retention. The other combinations actually decrease retention. And the baseline email that contains nothing is actually not the worst. The worst is when you only remind them of deadlines. Turns out students don't like to be nagged. So it's only all 3 of these that actually help in terms of improving student retention. Now, would we have predicted that? No, but that's the nice thing is you can try this. Which brings me to the last sort of high-level piece of this, which is improving learning outcomes. And there are 2 different places in which we think learning outcomes can be improved. The first of those is in the online format, and the second is in a physical classroom. So the learning format is a paper that I think is truly seminal in the field. Goes back 30 years to renowned educational researcher Benjamin Bloom, who wrote a paper called the 2 Sigma Problem. So in that paper, Bloom studied 3 populations. The first is this population of students who were subjected to a standard lecture-based classroom experience. Not a particularly large lecture, by the way, about 35 to 40 students. This is the distribution of achievement scores for that population of students. The red graph are students who still were taught in a lecture-based format, but using a mastery learning format, which means that they couldn't move on to the next topic before demonstrating competency at the previous one, giving them presumably a better basis for learning. The third population were those students who were lucky enough to get an individual human tutor. And what you can see is that the red population, the mastery population, is a full standard deviation, or sigma as it's called in statistics, improvement over the blue population. And the green population is yet another standard deviation, or sigma, above that. Now, what does a 2 sigma improvement in performance correspond to in terms of learning outcomes? If you take the midpoint, the median of the blue population as a performance threshold, then half the students in the blue population, the lecture-based population, are going to be above, and half are going to be below, because you take the median. If you take that same threshold and apply it to the green population, the individual tutoring population, 98% of the students are above that same performance threshold. So this is an intervention that can move 98% of the students to being quote-unquote above average. Now, hence the 2 sigma problem. Because Bloom points out that as a society, we can't afford to give an individual tutor to every student. And you can see that the rest of the title says, the search for methods of group instruction as effective as one-to-one tutoring. How do we do this in a group? So the question now becomes different, however. Because now we can potentially afford to give every student a tablet, or at least a smartphone. And so now the question becomes, can you use technology as opposed to group learning to move us from the blue curve to the red curve and ultimately the green curve? So the good news is that the red curve, I think, is well within reach. Because the nice thing about computers is that they do not get bored even if you see the same video 7 times. They're okay with that. They're even okay with grading, as you saw, the same assignment over and over again until you get it. And so mastery, I think, is well within reach of what computers can do today. The green curve, obviously, is a much bigger challenge. I mean, can you personalize instruction at the same level that a really perceptive human tutor can? No. But I think there's already elements of personalization that we're seeing here, both in the ability to go at your own pace, study material that is more interesting and relevant to you, and get some personalized feedback on some of the homework mistakes you're making. But I think there's a really exciting challenge and opportunity here for us to develop technology that gets us closer and closer to the green curve and see how far we can get. So that's one place where we can improve learning outcomes. The second, and this is one of my favorite quotes, is in our in-class instruction. So Edwin Slauson, who was an educator in the 19th century, said that college is a place where the professor's lecture notes go straight to the student's lecture notes without going to frame it either. Not a very flattering view, perhaps, of a lecture, but I don't think completely unwarranted. So I think that maybe one thing that we can do in that precious time where a professor and the students are acting in the same room together is something different. Going all the way even further back to Plutarch, who said that the mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting. So perhaps something that we can do in a classroom is, instead of this, we can move to this, where students get the content that they need, the mind filling, so to speak, from an online format, which I've already argued is in some sense more interactive and more engaging than a lecture with 300 students. And then show up to class and actually have a dialogue with each other and with the instructor. Now, people much smarter than myself have proposed this already. Here, for example, is a paper from Science in 2011 by Nobel Prize-winning physicist Carl Wieman, who's been an advocate for active learning in the classroom for a number of years. This was actually one of the larger such studies done. It had 270 students in each of 2 populations, lecture and active learning. And he showed that in every single metric, attendance, engagement, and learning, if you compare the lecture-based classroom, this by the way from an award-winning lecture, to the active learning population, each of those learning outcomes improves considerably, including performance on a standardized test. And so this is a place where by changing the way that we teach inside the classroom, we can get, I think, significantly better learning outcomes for our on-campus students who are privileged enough to be here with us. Which brings me to one last point here. This Christian Turwish is a professor from the Wharton Business School who taught the operations research class in Coursera. And the last lecture in his course is a case study of Coursera MOOCs as an operations research problem. It's 20 minutes, it's well worth watching. It's on YouTube, so you can take a look at it. I found it fascinating. And what he basically suggested is that MOOCs move the Pareto optimal frontier of education from where it currently is to a new frontier. So what this frontier is, it's a trade-off between faculty productivity, or the amount of time that faculty take to teach, versus student learning. And clearly, you can, if you do one-on-one instruction, such as office hours or individual tutoring, you're very low on the faculty productivity end, but presumably high on student learning. And then as you scale up to larger and larger classes, then you get more productivity at the cost of poorer learning outcomes. What Christian suggested is that MOOCs move us to a new frontier in this trade-off. And it's still inevitably a trade-off, but it allows us to now make decisions on how we want to use this new Pareto optimal frontier. Do we want to keep faculty productivity the same and improve learning outcomes, which is one of some of these active learning in the classroom ideas? Or do you want to keep student learning about the same and improve faculty productivity and reach by allowing a faculty to teach hundreds of thousands of students at a cost that's not much greater than it takes them to teach an on-campus class? So you can go this way, you can go that way, or you can go anywhere in between, depending on the trade-off that you want to make between these 2 attributes. Actually, I'm going to go directly here. So I'm going to now conclude this talk going back to the education for everyone. Now I'm going to tell you a few statistics about the population of students that we have and the kind of impact that this makes on them. So one interesting statistic, you can see the pie chart on the right, is that currently most of our students are actually educated. Yes. Okay. Where did you go? Okay. One of those, you can see that most of our students, actually about 80%, actually have degrees, college degrees, and half of those have advanced degrees. Now, partially I think it's because of the selection of courses that went up initially. Partially I think it's because we haven't had the credit option, which of course is much more important for students without degrees. But I think at the same time, it's also the case that the reason we have so many lifelong learners, people who have finished their formal education, is because formal education lasts you the first, 4 to 8 years of your adult life, from 18 to maybe 24. And then there's the rest of maybe 40 to 50 years of your life. And I think we've gotten to the point where the world is now moving far too quickly for the stuff that we learned in college 15 years ago to necessarily be enough to keep us productive members of society for the remaining 50 years. That might have been true 150 years ago, but it's not true today. And so we have an opportunity here to provide for anybody who wants to increase their education and learn something new, maybe to get a better job or to switch careers or just to even expand their minds. We have the option for them to have access to really high quality material that's going to allow them to do that. The second interesting graph is the population mix relative to geography. And you can see that you can't really see because this projector isn't very bright, that about a third of our students are in North America. That's the blue chart, that's the blue part of the chart. 28% are in Europe, and the remainder are in parts of the world that have relatively limited access to education. We have 3.6% in Africa, and those numbers are growing. And so I think this is really the priceless opportunity from a global perspective, because you have the option now to take education and convert it from something that is a privilege of the few to something that is a basic human right. Back in September, I attended the launch of the Education First initiative at the United Nations. And that is something whose goal is to achieve the Millennium Development Goals of getting every student, every primary and secondary school age child into a classroom by 2015, which is not that far from now. So it's a very ambitious goal. There's currently 60 million primary school age children who are not in school, and 110 million total who are not in school, primary and secondary. And that is a real tragedy. And of course, we're not dealing with the primary and secondary right now, but the fact is that this hunger for education is such a critical piece of what we can do as a society to make things better for everyone. And when they spoke about this at the United Nations, they said that they would go to refugee camps. People who don't have a home and who live on a cup of food a day, and you ask them, what do you want most? They don't say more food, and they don't say better shelter. They say better education for my children. Because they know that the only way for their children to emerge into a better life is to have access to education. And so that, I think, is something that we can really help do as a society to make the world better for everyone. So thank you.
We don't have a microphone.
Okay, okay, I'm going to start from the front and work my way back. Okay.
How do you fund Coursera?
How do I fund Coursera? Coursera is venture-backed. It's backed by two investors who are equally committed to the educational mission of the company. One of those, as a name you might know, is John Doerr, who was the lead investor in both Google and Amazon, and was also, as it happens, the first personal investor, not investor, but donor to the Khan Academy. And he thinks this is a truly important thing, not from the perspective necessarily of making money, but from the perspective of affecting change. But I think they think, and we agree with them, that it's possible to do well while doing good. Yes.
Do you have information about the students, like education that they have, age, So you collect that by a survey?
Surveys, yeah. So this is self-selected, which means there's a bias there that we don't completely understand. That is true. The only thing we have objective information of is country of origin, which we can get from IP addresses. Yes.
Hi, I was in your PGM class last year. And,
Did you finish? Or are you part of our completion stats?
and one of the things I wonder about is the asking questions is always a big problem, you know, if you don't understand something. You don't have anybody to ask questions to. And a lot of times when you go to the forums, the answers you get are wrong.
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, I don't know. We put in place a community TA system where people who did really well in the previous class were community TAs. I don't know which version of the class you took.
It was the first one.
It was the first one. So the first one didn't have community TAs. The second one had community TAs, which are people that we recruited who both did well on the homeworks and also participated on the forum. And we reached out to about 40 of them, and 20 of them, 19 said that they would be happy to be community TAs, and then they basically, they held office hours, they answered questions on the forum, they even fixed mistakes in the problem set. So you should have taken the second version.
Can you talk a little bit about how the courses get online and how much involvement you have with instructors and thinking through the instructional design process?
So there's 3 entities here. There is the instructor, then there is usually a team at the institution, Kristen, and people who work with Kristen here at UVA, but every institution has a Kristen. And we try and clone her, but we haven't quite succeeded. And then there is our course operations team who works instructor-facing. And what happens is that initially, our course ops team works relatively closely with the program manager and with the instructors because there isn't a lot of local expertise on how to do things. And then over the course of time, they kind of ratchet back a little bit, so the first line of defense becomes Kristen, and we do the sort of more in-depth stuff that maybe hasn't been tackled.
Yeah, I think this would be a pointed question, sort of exploratory. What motivated you to maybe speak here today? I feel like an online presentation of the same lecture could maybe reach more people.
So it's interesting that you bring that up. First of all, I actually do give about half of these online these days. But there's a special place in my heart for UVA, and they wanted me to come in person, so I'm here.
You want to do one more question?
What do you think are going to be the major problems that we'll face in the next 5 years?
Boy, I wanted to end on a positive note, so we're going to I don't know, major problems. I mean, there's, I guess it depends how you view problems. So, let me call them challenges. So, thinking about the developing world first, I think that there is an issue with infrastructure and with dissemination channels, just getting people to know about this. And by the way, it's not just in the developing world. We've heard from people who are sort of embedded in disadvantaged communities, even within the United States, that if you go to East LA, they don't know about this either. They don't know about the opportunities this provides them. So how do you get, and there's a digital divide, and do they have do they have enough broadband connectivity to get there? So I think those are challenges that we are not going to solve, but we would love to work with organizations who have that set of goals so that we can help bring our content to more people. I think there's going to be interesting challenges from just seeing how the ecosystem of higher education shakes out as a consequence of the availability of so much high quality content. And I think there's going to be challenges in thinking through how that affects the way in which we teach students on campus and navigating that in a way that improves learning outcomes as opposed to focuses just say on cost reduction in a way that really compromises the kind of learning experience that we provide to the students. So how do you balance the question of cost with the question of quality with these sort of relatively, I mean, this is not relatively, this amazing sort of magic that happens when there is a meeting of the mind between a professor and a student. So how do you bring all of that together into something that makes sense and is effective from a learning perspective? So I think those are some interesting challenges. Can we take one anyone that has a challenge has been? It was a good question. It was a positive question. Yes.
Okay.
I'll try to be positive.
Uh-oh.
Do you have any experience with any role that librarians have played in developing? I'm a professional librarian, at least this week, and I'm just interested in, I read with interest, the story the other day where the student had an expectation of no textbooks. I was a little bit nervous about that. But then I thought, my colleague Gary here, he was talking about how wonderful it was as he helped somebody put together a MOOC and find materials from the Hottie Trust to put in there. And I was like, that's jazz, that's great. But what other things have you seen?
I think that this is not a question.
Yeah.
I think there's interesting challenges having to do with third-party copyrighted content and how one can use that. A lot of the things that we rely on in on-campus teaching, such as fair use and the TEACH Act, don't immediately or don't obviously apply in these open online courses, and so one needs to navigate that also with care. And I think open educational resources is one important component in the solution that we have to think about. We encourage instructors to not require textbooks that cost money, because you mentioned that coverage about the student who couldn't afford it. I mean, there are students in Africa who write us and say, yeah, we could buy the textbook, but it's 3 months of our salary if we do that. And that's clearly not something you want to force people to do. So can you teach around those textbooks in a way that you provide at least a good, reasonable course experience, even to students who don't have the book? I think that's a challenge in and of itself. That having been said, and maybe this will end on a positive note, there's a certain amount of leverage to be had by having 2.7 million students. And we've been very fortunate in being able to go to some of the publishers, including some that you wouldn't necessarily think would cooperate, and be able to get access to things that they would normally charge for free. And so I think there is some interesting dialogue there to be had that might turn out to give an even richer experience to our students.